Hi students, let's look at another hypostyle mosque, the Great Mosque at Cordoba. Now the name Cordoba, you might also see it spelled and pronounced Cordova with a V. Both are correct, and many times you'll see it used interchangeably. So we're thinking of the same site when we say Cordoba and Cordova. Cordova is located in Spain, right over here. Now you know what we're going to do. We're going to look at the history of this area through maps. Yes! Cordoba is on the Iberian Peninsula, which was a part of the Roman Empire. Yes, okay, cool. In fact, two of Rome's greatest emperors, Trajan and Hadrian, came from the Iberian Peninsula of modern-day Spain. During the Tetrarchy, this portion was part of the Southwestern Empire. During the Byzantine Empire, it was one of those outskirts of territory that they fought for but really didn't have a strong control over. So unlike Damascus, Cordoba is not going to have the same kind of heavy influence of Byzantine architecture. During the Middle Ages, Cordoba is part of the difficult religious terrain on the Iberian Peninsula, in which both Muslim and Christian forces were vying for control. If you had control over the Iberian Peninsula, then you had control over trade routes between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. There's this small, narrow portion called the Gibraltar Strait, and if you controlled this territory, then you could control the in and out goings of the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. You could control what comes into and out of port. So it's a real powerhouse to control the Iberian Peninsula. We refer to this as the Iberian Peninsula, but it's also known as Al-Andalus, or the Andalusian Peninsula. In fact, today you still hear it referred to the geographic location as the Andalusian Plain. Al-Andalus was the name given to this territory by the Muslim invaders when they crossed North Africa and settled on the Iberian Peninsula. And then just bear with me, I'm going to scroll back to our spread of Islam here, the rise of Islam. Remember when we learned about the Umayyad Caliphate? The Umayyad Caliphate established themselves out of Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem, Damascus. And then as the faith grew, there were many disputes about control of the faith and the people. And the Umayyad Caliphate had to escape from the east, and they found refuge in the west. Spreading with the spread of Islam across the North African coast came a safe space for the Umayyad Caliphate, and they rose out of Morocco, and the converted Berber people, the Berbers are another ethnic group of people in North Africa, and with the Berber, the Umayyad Caliphate settled onto the Andalusian, or Al-Andalus portion of this Islamic world. And they set up several main cities: Zaragoza, Toledo, Granada, and for most of the Islamic control of Al-Andalus, Cordoba was the capital. And I want to emphasize how influential Cordoba was to Western Europe, because during the reign of the Byzantines, many of the intellectual hubs, cities with great libraries that house the works of ancient scholars in math and chemistry and engineering, those libraries were seen as heretical. They were anti-religious, and by order of the Byzantine emperors had been destroyed. With the establishment of the Christian faith, we saw a loss of classical knowledge. With the rise of Islam, we see the protection or the preservation of many classical texts. The writings of Socrates and Aristotle and Plato all were preserved not in their original libraries in Athens, which had been destroyed, but within the territories that were outside the reach of the Byzantine Empire, in the Islamic world. So with the Islamic faith, we see the preservation of the classical texts, of classical learning. And we're going to get into that in more detail with the medieval period. But I want us to establish that because Cordoba is a gateway for this type of knowledge into Western Europe. Okay? All right. Here we are looking at an aerial view of the Great Mosque of Cordoba. It too was a Friday mosque, and Cordoba, being an influential center of knowledge, it was just a hugely densely populated city, and the mosque itself is a beautiful statement to the rise of Cordoba and its leaders, because it was built and expanded upon by various generations. So that 200-year construction period, we can see it in this floor plan. The exterior walls, sure, there they are. And then we have minaret, courtyard, prayer hall, courtyard, prayer hall. Okay, but when we look closer at the floor plan, the original mosque, built in 786 AD or CE, was much smaller than what we see today. As rulers gained power and control and wealth, they added to the mosque. They expanded the prayer hall. They expanded the courtyard. This addition here was made in 987. Earlier additions. So the mosque is built upon addition of addition of addition. When we look at it today, you're also going to notice this church, this Christian church in there. We'll address it in more detail later, but the church, as you see it today, was built after the expulsion of the Muslims on the Iberian Peninsula to reestablish the Christian faith in an Islamic mosque by putting this taller church inside of the mosque prayer hall. Got it? We'll get to it again later. But let's take a look at this courtyard, because this courtyard is filled with these beautiful trees. Today, in modern times, this courtyard is planted with cypress and date palms and pomegranate trees, and it has 98 orange trees. When you visit Cordoba, it is called the Patio de los Naranjos, or the Orange Tree Courtyard. And it is considered one of the oldest living gardens in Europe because it was established alongside the initial building of the Great Mosque in 784. So this enclosed area that is now part of the mosque was originally a garden, and it's still blooming and thriving today. It's so beautiful. Let's go inside, shall we? Here's our floor plan. This is the outline of the current courtyard, and we're going to walk into this space right over here in front of the mihrab. Wow! I wasn't going to tell you until we walked in, but this is one of the most amazing prayer halls, and Cordoba's Great Mosque is celebrated for this stunning hypostyle prayer hall. So we're looking here at these stilted arches that also are horseshoe arches. And then another characteristic of Islamic art and architecture are the fact is the fact that these are two colors of stone, and I've given you the term bicolored. Bicolored arches. This element of Islamic architecture is something that you see throughout in other various regions, and then is influential in Western European architecture. So we want to look and recognize these bicolored arches as characteristic of Islamic architecture. Got it? Also, it adds to our statement of positive and negative, right? The positive and negative space of these of color, it helps to kind of lead your eye up and around in this playful manner. Another characteristic of Islamic architecture, I told you, playful surfaces and space, positive and negative space, these bicolored arches, pop, 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 pop. They do that. Horseshoe arches kind of billow, they kind of breathe up. Now, another characteristic that we see is this play of space with double row arches. So I've given you that term there as well. Double row arches. The double row arch, that stilted arch with the under horseshoe arch, creates, again, a play of positive and negative space. It has this dazzling surface effect of light and shadow. It also helps in terms of the function of this mosque, right? It's not a mosque today. Today it is currently a cathedral, a church. There is a bishop of the Cathedral Mosque of Cordoba. I say that because that's why there's no carpeting. That's why there's no textiles on the floor, because this is no longer used as an Islamic prayer hall. But we can imagine, lay down some of those gorgeous carpets, and then think about the space, a Friday mosque. It's hot in Spain, it's humid, and it's gonna need some air. And so above, in the ceiling, there are these skylights that allow light and air in, and then the ventilation through those double row arches. Also the light through those double row arches. So you see here, we're seeing that horseshoe arch and that gorgeous play of positive and negative space. You also see a skylight above that lets in the light, but imagine at nighttime. Remember, because you come here for 5 times a day. Where's the light going to come from? These lanterns. So these giant oil lamps above are going to blaze through, and then that light again will filter through the double row arches. A question that some of my architecturally minded students often ask when they look at the prayer hall is, why didn't they just make it a taller space? Why did they do double row arches? Why didn't they just make the columns go all the way to the ceiling? And that's a very good question. But it doesn't, there's 2 answers to that. First, it doesn't have the same kind of dynamic play of positive and negative space. Also, these columns, they're ancient Roman columns. So they have been taken and repurposed, but they're at a height that's a little squat. And to have that grandeur and majesty of the ruler's power, they want them to be taller. And so you have your column, which is a shorter Roman column, and then you have the stilted element of the arch, typical of Islamic architecture. And then why not? Why not add a little horseshoe arch in the middle, just to make things fun, make things playful? Yes! So it's a beautiful example of architecture, of repurposing, or spoilia. I'll put that definition at the bottom. Spoilia is the scholarship term for using or repurposing other elements of architecture, the spoils, right? The spoils of war. So the spolia of those Roman columns being repurposed in this Islamic mosque, but added to with these stilted columns and the horseshoe arches, or the stilted arches and the horseshoe arches to make double row arches. This playfulness of pattern and shape, you can even see it on the exterior. So here we are standing on the street looking at the exterior walls of the mosque. Isn't this just fantastic? What we see is this beautiful play of positive and negative shape and pattern. The scalloped, oh, that's a term right here. The scalloped arches that we see are another characteristic of Islamic architecture. So in addition to a horseshoe arch, you will often see these arches that have these multiple lobes. So they are referred to, these two right here, they're referred to as multi-lobed arches or scalloped arches. Scallop because it looks like the ridges of a scallop shell. Multi-lobe because you can think of those as like, ear lobes, or lobes. So you see multi-lobed arches are a characteristic of Islamic architecture, and they're here on the surface. They serve no purpose. They're not holding anything up. They're just on the side of the wall. And yet they create this beautiful pattern and movement of line and positive and negative, the bicoloredness. Look at how insane these horseshoe arches are as they overlap one another. I love it. It's so fantastic, right? So below this video, I want you to watch the video about pattern and geometric design because it is an element of Islamic architecture and art that is, what's the word? It is an element of art and architecture in the Islamic world that also is a reference to their iconic faith. The fact that there are no representations of figures, creatures, there is instead a play of pattern, of math. If you're a math nerd, you gotta check this out. These are all mathematical equations playing across the surface of the exterior walls. Let's go back inside the prayer hall. And we're going to be standing in front of the Maqsora. Remember? Maqsora, the screened area in front of the mihrab. So the mihrab is right back there. And look at how this Maqsora is created. Rather than the teak carved wood that we saw at the great mosque of Cordoba, here we have our multi-lobed, bicolored arches. The Maqsora, or the mihrab, in that beautiful horseshoe arch. Here's another view of the Maqsora. So I said bicolored, but really it's all one color stone, but the play of light and shadow is in the texture. Some of it's carved, some of it's smooth, and it creates a bicolored effect. Again, it's a play of surface pattern and texture. It's amazing. It's so rich in this abstract kind of motifs. Not only is it a double row arch, it's a horseshoe arch, a multi-lobed arch, and then there are these trans arches, which are multi-lobed as well. I mean, it's a geometric playground here. So math nerds unite and geek out over the architecture of the Great Mosque of Cordoba. As we close out our look at the Great Mosque of Cordoba, I said I would address the church in the middle of the mosque. This is part of the larger Reconquista, the reconquest, as it's referred to, of the Christian faith. And here we see in this map, starting around the year 1000, the religious tensions between the Christians and the Muslims on the Al-Andalusa became, or erupted. And Here we see the progression of the Christian faith and the shrinking of the Islamic control in the peninsula. When the Muslims lost control of Cordoba, they moved their capital down to Granada. And as Cordoba came under the power of the Christian Spanish rulers, was converted into a cathedral. And that is why today it is called the Cathedral Mosque of Cordoba. Now this brings up another type of discussion, a discussion of power by placement or absorption of the past. And we saw it in the Mosque of Damascus with the use of the Temple of Jupiter, the Church of John the Baptist, now being housed in the prayer hall itself. And at Cordoba, what I didn't mention earlier is that when the Muslim took control over the peninsula, at Cordoba, there was a Christian church that the rulers then converted into a mosque. For a time, I think it was like 50 years or so, it actually was a hybrid space. It was both the church, a Christian church, and an Islamic mosque. And then it was converted into a mosque completely. So here we see the reverse, where now with the Christian Spanish kings, they take the religious space of a mosque and make it a cathedral, right? This structure that I'm focusing in on here was added by the Spanish Holy Roman Emperor Charles I. And here we are standing underneath it. It is extremely Christian in its architecture. It looks like a Gothic church, which we're not going to get into in this class, but I mean, ironically, Gothic architecture was heavily influenced by Islamic architecture, especially in and from Cordoba. But what we see here is an absorption of the sacred space and a reassignment of it from Islam to Christianity. Here's another watercolor view. This watercolor was sketched in 1836. But I use it because you see our characteristic double row arches, and we see a Christian procession of priests, and here's a monk, a bishop. You see some followers kneeling in front of chapels. And oftentimes we think about these things as old, of the past, not relevant anymore. But in reality, they are still very much a part of our lives and our identity. In fact, recently, I think it was in 2020, maybe it was November of 2020, the Cathedral Mosque of Cordoba was reassigned on Google Maps as simply the Cathedral of Cordoba. And immediately, people all around the world started to cry out for this to be reverted back to Cathedral Mosque. That the petition stated that this was a removal of history. It was a removal of the story of Cordoba, of the Andalusian, of the Iberian Peninsula. And a lot of people were blaming the Catholic Church in Spain, specifically the Bishop of Cordoba, as trying to Christianize and remove its Islamic past. And it was switched back. So Google Maps now, when you look at it, it says Cathedral Mosque of Cordoba. But even today, the people understand and identify the history of their past, the past of this land, and they want to acknowledge it in the name Cordoba Mosque or Cathedral Mosque of Cordoba.